Thank you, Ellen. Thanks for everybody being here. Marty and I are delighted. So many people are turning up. So many people who are guests. I think there are some people who are guests who didn't stand up, which is all right too. So thanks for being here. It's been our pleasure to design this series of programs, September, October, November, and we began by talking about the major goals of League of Women Voters Everywhere, and that's really engaging voters and defending democracy. And what we're going to really be focusing on today is the engaging voters. I'm going to give credit. We mentioned Ann Norbury already, but this program might look very different if Ann Norbury had not heard our speaker Patrick Miller speak at a consensus meeting, and within hours she emailed somebody and said, we've got to get this guy as a speaker. And we made big bucks to have
more
him
enthusiastic than my students.
And then she wrote again and she said, oh, he was on Ruckus. How many of you saw Patrick on Ruckus? Okay. Very different personality on Ruckus. I had the chance to see him present with the Young Democrats, a very different personality. So we'll see which Patrick we get today. It's really a pleasure to have that. I had suggested when we were first posing the program some months ago that we should really be talking kind of about the science, instead of just get out the vote, because we're all doing get out the vote. And so it's really exciting to have him join us. It's also exciting to have Lindsay with us. The work that Mainstream is doing, the work that Lindsay is doing is exciting, and the fact that she said, hey, I'll just hang around for this afternoon and also do some more training. So let me then introduce Patrick. He is the assistant professor of political science at the University of Kansas. He came a long way in the rain. His areas of specialization are American politics, including, I forgot to put my reading glasses on, political research methods. He did his, I'm jumping here, Patrick. He did.
You don't have to read it.
I do have to read it, or else I'll make it up. It might be pretty good anyway. But I was really quite struck. He had gone to College of William and Mary, which had been one of my fantasy schools. I didn't end up there, but I think it's a wonderful place to have gone. Moved on to the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, did his postdoctorate at Duke, and this is what really stands out for me. He established a survey research center and then he moved on to the University of Cincinnati and has ended up here in Kansas for 2013. It's just really great to have him. I asked him for his bio, and so the very last thing he said is that last fall, the Kansas City Pitch named him as one of the reasons we love Kansas City. Yeah. And we will too. We'll put that in our newsletter. One Voters loves Kansas, loves Patrick and Lindsay. His Twitter account. All right, if anybody wants to write his Twitter account, it's P. Miller at 1693.
There's no S.
So there you go. Is that right? Okay. So let me. Pardon me?
It was P. Miller, 16.
P. Miller. What did I say?
Which was the year William and Mary was founded.
Lindsay Behgam is our second speaker. You've heard us say she is currently working as the voter engagement coordinator for Mainstream Education Foundation, the nonpartisan political advocacy organization created to really engage individuals to advocate for good governance, quality public education, health, healthy communities, and a sustainable fiscal system. She had worked in the mayor's office in Kansas City, Kansas, where she oversaw staff policy and projects and policy engagement. She also has been, I have to hold this up. She's had previous roles in corporate community relations, a number of Kansas political campaigns, local and state and federal levels. So we're delighted to have them both here. I want to hold up two things. On your chair, you have an index card. When you have questions, if you will write the question, if you need a pen, we've got pens, or your neighbor might have a pen. And if it's a question for Patrick or for Lindsay, just you can put P at the top or L at the top, write, and then you send it this way, if you're on that side, and this way, Marty and Kathy Nix will pick it up, and then Candy Birch will get the cards as we go on, kind of organize and look at them. We also, again, thanks to Candy, have for you an evaluation form. Again, if you're going to need a pen or pencil to complete this, please do. We really like feedback. It's really helpful for us. And what we have been over on the table, as you walk out, you're going to see a fairly flat metal wicker basket, and just put your evaluations in there. So I will move on. I'm looking, it's 9:15, Candy. We did a good job. So, Patrick, welcome.
Thank you.
Wrong one.
So, did you still want me to talk? So it's at 45 minutes, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'll try to take less than
Candy's
that.
your timekeeper.
Oh, I'll keep it. Oh, there's the clock up here already. I'll turn that. Okay, I guess that works. Okay, well, thanks for having me here. Probably what she was alluding to is that in my natural form, I'm a viciously sarcastic and kind of mean human being, which is endearing to most people that I know, and those who don't like it, like whatever. But I often tend to behave in public, kind of. Depends. But I have a gallon of coffee in me, and I have 4 hours of sleep, so who knows what you're going to get from me. Very often. Okay, so hopefully I won't break your eardrums. So I was asked to come today and talk about what...
Oh, maybe it's the clicker that is interfering with... Yeah, there you go.
Here, how about that? Okay, so I was asked to come talk today about what political science research can tell us about voter turnout and how you increase it. And I would love to be able to tell you that there's some magic bullet that can be instituted in terms of policy reform or actions that you or even frankly campaigns can take to increase turnout, but I would be lying to you if I said that there were, because quite frankly, organizations like yours and even political campaigns come to the turnout dynamic very late in the game. And most of what predicts what people like you or me or people who are not here, most of what predicts whether or not we're going to vote is actually set pretty early in our lives. So, yeah, I mean, there are some things that we can talk about that...
Maybe you could
It
click it
wants me to
for
go
her.
home.
Do you want me to? She can click it for you.
Okay.
Oh, it could be.
Maybe they're both on.
Yeah, that's it. They're both.
Okay,
Yeah,
about that.
that's it. Okay.
All right, I'll try to get back into my groove. So yeah, I mean, there are things that organizations like yours and that campaigns can do to marginally increase turnout. And if you really want to geek out, I can tell you how we as political scientists study that. We can talk about those things, but I want to start with giving you some data on what turnout generally looks like, and the more deep-rooted issues that shape turnout before you ever get to talk to a voter. So what am I going to talk about? What does turnout look like? What do we know shapes turnout? This is much less sarcastic than the names I put in my lectures for class. And what can be done by groups like yours to increase turnout?
I think it's cute.
So let's start with figuring out what turnout looks like overall and who votes and who doesn't. Basic stuff you've got to know before you tackle the problem. So if we look at turnout in the scope of American history and presidential elections, where those are the highest turnout, we actually, we hear a lot that we've had a decline in turnout. To an extent that's true, but we're also higher turnout than we used to be. So, as political scientists, we like data, so we can actually go back to voter rolls. They exist back to the first elections and see what turnout looked like. So we were very small turnout when the Republic started, and in the early part of the 20th century, we were more up in the range of 80%, but really since the 1910s, maybe World War I started a decline, and then since the 60s, we settled into this period of, say, 55 to 60% turnout. So not as bad as we were, but not as good as we were. And this is voting eligible Americans. If you look at just registered voters, turnout is obviously higher, but this is penalizing the turnout rate for those of us who aren't even registered. So obviously this goes up and down. We've had a series of presidential elections lately that have been higher turnout than normal. So there is variation in that. And of course, if we were to look at midterm turnout, that goes down even lower. In midterms, your lower propensity voters drop out of the electorate generally. And the lowest turnout is especially in local elections, especially nonpartisan elections, or at least seemingly nonpartisan, because they're not really, but that's a whole other issue. But think about the kind of local elections that you have here in Johnson County, where they are on the surface nonpartisan elections for city council, school board, that kind of thing. Those are the lowest turnout elections that we see throughout our democracy. Local elections that are partisan have a little higher level of turnout because people come out to support their team, or at least overtly partisan. But the kind of turnout rates that you see here in your local elections are not actually unusual. Those elections just unfortunately tend to engage people a lot less. So let's put Kansas in context. So here, states that are greener have higher turnout, states that are redder have lower turnout. Kansas, we're about in the middle of the pack. We're about average, 54% turnout in 2016, if we look at the voting eligible population. Minnesota and Maine and New Hampshire always put everyone else to shame on this, but states like Texas and California, more in the Sun Belt, not very good. But we're in the middle of the pack, so not especially great, but also not especially bad. And of course that varies within the state. So some counties in Kansas are really high turnout because they have demographics that are higher turnout propensity groups. Some counties are lower turnout. So if we look at turnout rates by group in 2016 from various sources of data, you can see just how big some of these divisions are. So for example, one of the biggest divisions in terms of turnout is education. Only 31% of Americans without a high school degree and just 49% of high school grads voted in 2016. But that goes up to 67% among those of us who had some college to a college grad, 85% of post-grads. Race is also a pretty big division. 65% of whites voted, 60% of African Americans, and about 45% of Asians and Latinos voted. Age is also another pretty big division. So if we look at 18 to 29-year-olds, only 43% of them voted. But if we look at 60 plus, which is how the census cut this down, 71% voted. Of course, age and race overlap a lot. If we look at the 60 plus population in the US, about 75% of them are white. If we look at the 18 to 29 demographic, only about 55% of them are white. So a lot of the age issue is actually driven by racial disparities between what different age cohorts look like. We've entered an era where women are more likely to vote and be civically participatory. I think I invented the word civically. It's like, what, it's 9:30 on a Saturday morning. Take what you get, and this is pretty normal. Women had a 60% turnout rate, men 55%. About 12 years ago, women opened up the turnout advantage over men, which reversed decades of the opposite being true. And if you really want to talk about things that are not necessarily non-political, men are withdrawing from civic life throughout the U.S., especially young men, while women are getting more civically engaged. But if you want to have a sociology lecture, that's probably a different topic. So this turnout gap is only growing. Income, which of course overlaps a lot with age and education and race. If you look at the lowest income quartile in the U.S., only 46% of them voted. If you look at the top income quartile, 84% of them voted. And marriage. But marriage is not really something that drives turnout. A lot of research suggests that people who are more likely to be civically, I got it right that time, engaged, they're more likely to have more friends, they're more likely to join civic groups, to join the PTA. They're also more likely to be married. So something like marriage, it's not that being married is actually making you vote. The data don't suggest that. But the people who are more likely to be civically engaged are doing all kinds of things like getting married and talking to their friends and voting. And that is also opening up as another quite substantial division. So think about Johnson County, for example. You, in the spectrum of Kansas, you are a pretty high turnout county, but you're also a pretty white, pretty well-educated, pretty wealthy county with a disproportionate number compared to the U.S. of established married families. So you have a really high, generally on average, you have pockets of low turnout in this county, but you just have more of the people who are more likely to vote. But if I go to Wyandotte or Douglas or Southwest Kansas, where we actually have some majority Latino counties, or some of the counties in Kansas that are overwhelmingly white, but also below average in education and income, turnout there is going to be a lot lower. So, yay, Johnson County, I guess you have less of an issue. So, if that's what turnout looks like, what do we know shapes turnout? And this is where I may disappoint some of you, because it actually turns out, according to the best ways that we can study this as political scientists, the least important aspect is the tactics that you all in campaigns are actually going to use when election time comes. And the best shapers of turnout are, frankly, what happens before election season even starts. Things like education and attitudes that I guess a little graphic here. So it turns out that even though we have these demographic disparities, there's not a whole lot about demographics per se that really is shaping turnout. Most of those differences are explained by things like education, attitudes that people have towards the political system, and then who gets mobilized by campaign, but also issues of access. So if you really have to think of what are the things that you can do to increase turnout, it's stuff before you all ever get into the field or a campaign. It's things like education and attitudes that I'll talk to you a little bit about. And then you all come in, or campaigns come late in the process, when a lot of turnout is already pretty much set. So what do I mean by that? So think about education, for example. So we have a lot of very interesting longitudinal studies where we track students starting in elementary school. And we may track them, the first of these studies started in the 50s, so we track them almost at the end of their life. And we can see how the educational experience shapes political and civic engagement later in life. So K-12 educational experience is, quite frankly, the most important time to engage with young citizens, because it far outweighs as a predictor of voting even late in life. It's far more important than what's happening after they get out of K-12 or what's happening when you all try to talk to them about the virtues of voting. So on things like civic engagement, voting, paying attention to the news, even knowing who the president or the vice president is, basic facts like that, the K-12 experience is the best predictor of that. Well, let me preface this, I always like to say this, you all are really weird, because you all probably have an obscene amount of political knowledge for an average American. You're probably perplexed why often, so the only fact you can actually bank on Americans really knowing consistently, a majority of Americans knowing, is who the president is. There are Americans who learn what party the president is for the campaign and then forget it, because it's not a necessary fact for a lot of people. But it may amaze you to know that someone like the Speaker of the House or the Vice President, less than 50% of Americans know who those people are. So you all know a lot. You're weird. You're also here in the rain at 9:30 on a Saturday morning to listen to me babble on. So as I tell my students, things may surprise you, but put yourself in the place of a person who politics isn't necessarily that important. They hate politics. They don't think politicians care about them. And it may be a passing interest, just like some of you may be passingly interested in, I don't know, craft beer or football, right? So put yourself in the position of people who aren't like you. But coming back to this, right? So what is it that we know about the K-12 educational experience? And education researchers have done a lot of really interesting research on this. It's basically course content and what gets emphasized in course content. That actually tends to be one of the best predictors if we look at the K-12 educational experience, particularly exposure to social studies in elementary schools, starting early and consistently having exposure to civics courses, or government courses, or history courses that emphasize civics. For a study that I did with one of my colleagues at KU, we looked at very interesting longitudinal data about what does civic engagement look like among students who take a journalism class in high school. And so it turns out, if you take a journalism class in high school, you have a 20% greater likelihood of starting to vote in your 20s than if not. And the interesting effect is, who does that actually benefit? It benefits students in the lower propensity turnout groups. So the white student from the rich family with college-educated parents probably isn't going to become a voter because they took a journalism class. But the Latino or African-American student from a lower income household with parents who maybe didn't go to college, they're going to be the big beneficiary of that kind of class content, as well as everything else that we see here. Because if we think about, the highest turnout demographics, white, well-educated, high income, their families are engaging them in civic life, and they are teaching them to participate and giving them positive and reinforcing messages far more than people in lower turnout groups. So they don't benefit as much from this experience. And one thing that alarms me as a social scientist is I actually see the social studies content being cut out of courses. Last year, for the first time at KU, I got freshmen who've never had a high school government class. Of course, they weren't from Kansas, but that is increasingly common. Or in my previous life before graduate school, I was a teacher with Teach for America in Atlanta Public Schools. Technically, we had, teaching 5th grade, civics on the curriculum, but we never taught it because it was not going to be tested. We taught reading and math and things that were going to be tested, so we never talked about science. We never talked about social studies because we're doing math and writing drills. And my students missed out on a critical formative experience that now, 15 years later, is probably making them less likely to vote. So that experience is really setting the foundation for citizenship and adulthood because most Americans start voting once they're out of the K-12 environment. And that 18 to 30 period is still a very critical period for social engagement, where people are learning to be politically engaged. So you probably can't see this graphic too well, but this is turnout, average turnout 2002 to 2016 by age cohort. And the greatest increase in turnout across the lifespan is in this 20 to 30 age period, where most Americans don't go to college. So for most Americans, their educational experience ends at high school. And what they have learned in the K-12 environment is then left with them and shaping them in this 18 to 30 period where now they're independent, now they're adults, and they're learning how to be civically engaged. So this is still a very critical period of socialization. If you're thinking about who is it that groups like yours need to target, it's youth. Anyone under the age of 30, also people in the K-12 experience. If you don't start voting by the time you're 30, again, we have reams of longitudinal data that look at this. If you never vote before you're 30, there's a 90% chance that you're never going to vote in your life, even in high turnout elections. So again, this is a critical period. Engaging youth, particularly today's youth, because they're very, very alienated from the political process. So education is important, and I think it's obviously something that campaigns don't deal with. But it's something that you as civically involved people can think about how you can tackle that in different ways. But also attitudes are very important. So again, reams of data. In the 1960s, Americans are getting more distrustful of government and politicians. We feel more alienated from government. We feel less efficacious. And by that I mean we feel less likely that we can understand politics, but also that we can affect politics. And these attitudes are especially prominent among our lowest turnout propensity groups. And studies suggest, including a couple that I've done, that these attitudes actually have a very strong causal impact on turnout. So this is from data from a survey that actually I did about 6 months ago on a totally unrelated topic, but this ended up being something that I wanted to include as a measure. And so if you're a closet social science scientist or anywhere, this is a question that we would put in an external efficacy scale. Not that you need to know that, but to measure these kind of weird attitudes, we ask people statements and we ask them how much they agree and disagree with them. So this is a typical statement that we as political scientists might ask. Public officials don't care much about what people like me think. How much do you agree or disagree with this? And you have the option to be neutral. We'll look at some of these divisions. So if we look at Americans who have less than a high school education, 82% of them agree that elected officials don't care about what they think. And that drops down to 51% among those of us who have a post-grad education. Look at race, just 55% of whites agree that public officials don't care about what they think. 83% of African Americans, roughly 75% of both Latinos and Asians. 95%, and this is not an aberration in my survey. This is something we find in national surveys repeatedly. 95% of respondents in my survey under the age of 30 agreed with this, that elected officials, public officials don't care much about what they think. You look at the oldest cohort here, I cut it up to match the census, just 58% of Americans, 60 plus. Men more likely to believe this than women, 70% and 62%. Look at income. 89% of the Americans in the lowest income quartile agreed that that public officials don't care about what they think. Just 45% of the highest income quartile thought that. And again, we see our nice marriage division here. So these are some of the same divides that matched up with who votes and doesn't vote. And so if you're looking at the demographics that are less likely to vote, a lot of it is not just the educational experiences they're getting, but what kind of attitudes that they get out of that. Are they having positive exposure to government while they're young, to elected officials? Are you, as their parents and grandparents, drilling into their head the idea that politicians are awful and bad people and they can't affect politics? Because that's part of it too. It's not just everyone else's problem. We live in a political culture that's incredibly cynical about politics. And frankly, these attitudes that people carry, especially youth today, right? I mean, you've got to think about the politics of youth and why someone like Bernie Sanders might have appealed so much to people under the age of 30, because they see him as different from how most politicians act. I mean, he'll align with their politics as well. But someone like him who doesn't seem like the Sanders politician is probably going to appeal to a generation who really thinks that politicians are not very good people. And so therefore, why vote, right? So then we come to what organizations like yours do and what campaigns do, right? So again, you all are coming to this turnout game after all this has happened, after education has happened, after they have been exposed and formed attitudes that politics is a horribly corrupt system. And then you want to come into that environment and try to get people to vote. Yay, right? So if we just take what we just saw off the table, what is it that's going to make people? So if we imagine that we haven't measured the educational experience, we haven't measured attitudes, alienation, and so forth. I mean, we just look at what happens in a campaign. What's going to make people vote, right? Well, competitive elections, right? So it's not just that an election is contested, but that it's competitive, and that there's a sense that my vote matters. And especially if we get down to, so one of my punchlines is going to be that a local election is where you all can probably have the most influence on getting people out to vote. Think how many of your local elections in Johnson County and elsewhere in Kansas are totally uncontested. I mean, just as an anecdote, no one running for Leawood City Council had an opponent last time, right? I mean, what is happening in the political culture of a community like Leawood, where it's ostensibly a democracy, but it's, hey, let's elect the incumbents uncontested, right? That kind of political environment does not bring people out to vote. Or what happens in a political environment where people get angry that there are contested elections? Like, why are you challenging this person that I like? Why are you running against me? So competition is good because it's going to bring people out. Campaign contact, especially in person from campaigns, is incredibly effective. If you have to think about, would you rather phone bank or door knock, you'd rather door knock. Partisan elections. So about 85 to 90% of Americans either overtly call themselves Republicans or Democrats, or they lean to one of the parties. And the little secret about independent leaners is that they're actually just as partisan as people who call themselves Democrats and Republicans. They just don't like to call themselves independents. So really only about 10 to 15% of Americans are truly independents. They're actually the worst citizens because they're the least politically knowledgeable, they're the least likely to vote. Yeah. One thing I harp on my students, I did this really interesting experiment in the same survey. I looked at partisanship and political knowledge. So if you're a strong Republican or a strong Democrat, you're about 95% likely to be able to locate Canada, Mexico on a map. If you describe yourself as a pure independent, just 70%, right? So I could get, like, pure independents tune out from politics because they might not like the process, but I don't buy that negativity in politics is making them not know where Canada and Mexico are. They're just a less politically interested group. The point being, right, that most people are partisan, and partisanship bests them in politics. So partisan elections have higher turnout. Most local elections in America are actually partisan. So where I'm from in Virginia, we have partisan elections for city council, school board. It boggles my mind that you don't. in Kansas, but the kind of elections that you have here are the least likely to bring voters out, because you're forcing people who aren't that interested to engage with personalities and issues rather than like, rah-rah, support my team. Media coverage. When elections are covered, people turn out more. And unfortunately, most local elections in America don't have much coverage, especially as local media is dying and state house reporters are being eliminated. We see less coverage of state and local politics, and we have interesting studies that tell us that as that coverage disappears, turnout declines, because the media is not there as something to focus our attention on that level of politics. But also social influence from family and friends, right? I mean, you all have your own little social circle that you have a lot of influence on. Most people you don't have influence on. But if you can influence 5 people, and all of us can influence 5 people, that adds up, right? So influence from within your social sphere, even if you hate politics, you think politicians are corrupt and don't listen to you, and you don't want to vote, peer pressure is an incredibly effective way to overcome a lot of those attitudes. The downside of this is that all of these things, they're usually most effective on people who are more likely to vote anyway, or they're targeted at people who are more likely to vote. So unfortunately, voting becomes a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, in the sense that if we look at the people who are most likely to pay attention to media coverage, to know that an election is going on, even at the level of saying, that's my party, I want to support my candidate, they're not likely to people who are low turnout propensity. And we also know that campaigns generally don't pay a lot of attention to people who are poor voters, I mean, bad voters, right? I mean, many of you have probably worked on a political campaign, and you know if someone is only an occasional or a never voter, you're not going to go knock on their door, they're not worth your time. You're going to spend your time on that more frequent voter, or some person who votes maybe half the time. And we know from a lot of data that campaigns are generally not reaching out to the people who are not already engaged. So in that sense, they're not getting stimulated. So that said, if we look in the context of a campaign, and again, if you're interested in how we know this, I can talk about a lot of the studies, what is it that actually is motivating people? What is more effective? What is less effective? Let me have my swig of coffee here. Most effective in-person political engagement, so door knocking, right? That's going to be far more effective than mailers, than signs, than robocalls, than phone calls or emails. Having a human being in your face trying to engage with you is incredibly important and mobilizing. Media coverage, again, right? The media is focusing attention, and all kinds of media, on what's going on. People get the message, there's politics here, let's engage. And unfortunately, in a lot of communities, that coverage doesn't exist. Not the TV show Friends, but Friends, right? Social pressure. A lot of us don't want to talk about politics with our friends or family. I know when I go home, I know. Which are many things I don't want to talk to my family about. That's a whole other issue. This is not a therapy session. I'm talking about my mother. I love my mother, but okay. So we're getting more into my classroom personality. So let's just take that. So, but friends, right? Most Americans will tell us in surveys that they have a very set network of people that they talk to about politics. And not surprisingly, it is the people that they already know agree with them and are politically engaged. So most of your friends, right, we have great studies of Facebook. When you post about politics on Facebook and you have people in your network who are not politically engaged, they just skip over it. They don't come to social media for that. So social media is actually a pretty poor mobilizer. But you have to think about it, right? The people who comment on your political post are the people that you know are already not going to fight with you, and you know they're already going to vote anyway. So how can you engage that friend of yours who you know they like you, they just don't want to talk about politics with you, right? I mean, that's the kind of person that you can personally leverage in your network, and just putting it in their face on Facebook or Twitter is not going to do it. But most of us don't want to go the next step and have that conversation with them. And we say that we don't. Social pressure, right? That kind of social pressure, or there's really nifty mailers where campaigns look at the voter file and they mail you your neighbor's turnout record, and they say, voting is good. Here's how often your neighbors vote, and you haven't voted, right? It angers people, but it increases turnout by about 15%. And that's all public record, because it's a form of public shaming. And that's the most effective mailer you can actually do. We have very interesting studies of that. Which comes to the next point, that negativity is a lot more effective than positivity. As human beings, we are just hardwired to pay attention to negative information. There's some really interesting studies, one that I'm involved in right now, where we can stick people in an fMRI machine where we can actually look at activation of blood and electricity in their brain. And we can look at information, positive, negative, in political and non-political contexts. Our brains don't light up so much when we get positive information, right? I mean, we hear like puppies are cute, whatever, you know, something that's nice, that we don't have to engage with that. But when we hear negative information, our brains light up, right? Whether it's brown recluses have been spotted in the building, or Trump or Obama have this really potentially harmful bill, right? Negative information engages us. It mobilizes us. It gets us to pay attention, and it also gets us to break our habits, right? And one of those habits can be not voting. So if you want to think about the kind of messages that are most effective, it's not going to be vote because it's your civic duty. It's going to be something like vote because, I don't know, democracy. You fill in the message, democracy will suck, democracy will die, or people are going to pass bad policies to harm you. I guarantee you, you will engage more people with that kind of message. But also diversity engages people. So it should not surprise you that the most civically engaged people in America are older, white, pretty well educated, pretty high income, and that lower turnout propensity groups are not as well represented in, say, groups like this. Or they're not as well represented in campaign activists or party activists. And so you think about, how do we get the young African American male who is politically alienated, maybe only has a high school education, is probably not ever going to vote, but you want them to vote, just going off turnout demographics. They're not going to be a voter generally. Well, a 65 plus suburban grandparent is probably not the best messenger for that, right? It's someone who they can identify with, right, for whatever reason. And unfortunately, or that's just kind of how we are as Americans, race is one of the biggest predictors of how we identify with other people. We are just more trusting of people who are the same race as us. And so you think about, how do you mobilize low turnout minority communities, getting more people from minority communities engaged in your effort, and then going into those communities, because they will be better messengers of the you should vote message. And again, studies will say that can maybe have a huge effect on mobilizing people to vote. Almost done. So what doesn't work very well? Calls, not very effective. Again, interesting studies on that. The most that any study has ever been able to identify, field experiments political scientists have done, is a 2% increase in turnout among people who are targeted by robocalls or live callers on the phone. That's not very much. It's kind of a waste of your time. But if you look at door-to-door activities, the turnout increase can be more in the range of 8 to 10%, which means that 90% of your effort is wasted, but it's more effective than something like this. It's impersonal, it's electronic. Or like text messages that a lot of campaigns are increasingly starting to use, or door hangers, or yard signs, or mailers, or social media where you're just speaking to the people who already agree with you and are already going to vote. You're not making yourself uncomfortable by engaging with people who don't want to engage with you. Or candidate forums, right? I mean, think of who comes to your candidate forums. You all, but you're weird. Right? It's not the people who aren't voting. So again, how do you engage those populations? The last point I'm going to make is access. And this is, if I ever talk about anything about turnout, this is the attempt to keep people that matters. So in and of themselves, they're very interesting studies. Electoral reforms don't alter turnout much. Rather, they need to be exploited by groups like yours or campaigns to actually increase turnout. So think about early voting. We've had a lot of early voting changes in America in the last few years in terms of states adopting it, localities getting rid of it, or altering the early voting window. So we were able to look at jurisdictions and actually see within the same jurisdiction, in comparable types of campaigns, what happens to the turnout rate once you alter early voting. So it's an interesting kind of natural experiment. The answer is not much, right? So I think particularly, it becomes a very partisan issue. Right? I mean, if you think about the groups that don't vote as much, they tend to be more Democratic, which is why you can see the issue of electoral reforms, voter ID, early voting becomes so partisan. But I guess the punchline for Democrats is that early voting isn't that important for turnout, because who takes advantage of early voting? It's your highest propensity voters anyway. They just want to go vote and get it over with, right? And the data absolutely support that. Now, anecdotally here and there, if they're engaged, there's a low turnout voter who's going to come out and vote early, but that's the exception. Same thing with vote by mail. We have some states that have adopted vote by mail, no real effect on turnout. And in fact, if you look at, say, counties like Douglas County, we have a tax referendum that's entirely vote by mail. That's the lowest turnout election that we have. Like, I don't even ask for that ballot, it just shows up. And turnout is obscenely low, right? So just because you have that easy access doesn't mean it's going to be something that increases turnout. Same-day registration, not much of an effect, but it has the best potential. So if you think about people in the lowest turnout groups, they're more alienated, they're less interested from politics, they're likely to engage with elections later. They're likely to engage with elections closer to election day when the deadline to register to vote is already passed. So if we look at same-day registration, who tends to do it? Young people, non-white voters, lower income voters, lower education voters. Because they're not paying as much attention along the way, but if you give them the opportunity to register on election day, after they've tuned in close to the campaign, they'll do it. Not overwhelmingly, but if you want to increase turnout, that is the reform that's going to be the most effective. Not early voting, not vote by mail. But we do know that if we institute things like voter ID or proof of citizenship requirements, that those actually do decrease turnout. Oftentimes not because they're necessarily preventing access, but it's because if you think about people who are less likely to vote, part of it is not caring as much, not being engaged as much. And if you put the additional barrier in the way, like having to show proof of citizenship to register to vote in Kansas, it shouldn't then surprise you that most voters caught up in that are your pure independents, or young voters, or minority voters. Though certainly there are access issues. So if we look at Latinos, for example, even Latinos who are American citizens, 20 to 25%, depending on the study that we look at, don't have an official government ID. So obviously that becomes an impediment to access in certain states like Texas, where you do have a quite rigid requirement for ID. So last slide, what can be done by groups like yours to increase turnout? Because I probably have depressed you to the point that you're going to go home and just quit all civic engagement because probably doesn't matter. Sorry. So you have certain disadvantages, obviously, as a group. I think it's healthy to be aware of. You're nonpartisan, so you're not able to engage, you're not able to identify with most Americans on that level as you're part of their team, you share their values, you're something different outside of that. You're not integrated necessarily into the educational process. I don't know what kind of K-12 programs you all may have, but I know when I was in school in Virginia, the League of Women Voters was not something that we were exposed to, or when I taught in Georgia. So you're not necessarily part of that educational process. And election time is pretty late in the game when you think about when you, or even campaigns, think of being civically engaged. But so if you want to solve the deep-rooted problems, right? I mean, if you want to focus on an election, be like, let's go door knock, let's go mobilize churches and other types of organizations where we might find lower turnout voters, that's awesome. And I would absolutely encourage you to do that. But again, you're not going to have necessarily a huge effect. But increasing turnout 10% can be great. That can be very good. But if you want to solve the bigger problem of 40 to 50% of Americans not voting, or when we get down to the level of a local election in Kansas, 95% of voters not voting, you really have to deal with the deeper issues of lack of exposure to civics early in life, lack of social pressure to become engaged, and the attitudes that especially young people have that none of it matters and no one cares. So things like partnerships with other organizations, right? So if you want to mobilize African American or Latino voters who are less likely to vote, you might go to churches or other kinds of organizations where you find more of those voters. But we know from studies that look at groups like yours, those partnerships mostly don't exist. And if they do exist, they exist with groups that tend to match them demographically. So just generally speaking, if an organization like yours is going to go out and have a community partnership, it's going to be generally with another organization like a church that is higher income, higher education, pretty white. right? People who are already more likely to vote. So you're not necessarily getting to those lower propensity voters. Media partnerships, encouraging coverage of elections. That's incredibly important. Are partnerships with K-12 schools possible? And nonpartisan elections, right? I mean, nonpartisan elections don't bring people out because they don't have that party cue. But if you think about where you can have the biggest it's probably not in a presidential election. It's something like in a city council election, 5–10% turnout, where a little bit of effort to even explain to people why this office matters, how they affect your life, having actually contested elections, and getting media coverage of forums, and getting people through social pressure to engage with candidates, that's where you can have the biggest oomph in that kind of August election for an office that most people don't think about when we're all thinking about Trump or Obama. And targeting voter demographics that campaigns usually target less often, which are your younger, lower income, lower education, minority voters. I would love if we had greater participation amongst those groups. Quite frankly, most campaigns aren't bothering them as much because they have limited time, they have limited resources, and they want to put their effort into that person in maybe the 40–60% turnout probability range, not the person with only 30 or 10% chance of voting. But that's where organizations like yours, who aren't making partisan electoral strategic calculations, can come in and focus on the groups that need the most engagement. Because campaigns aren't doing it. So I think that was all. And she said 45 minutes, I ran 43.
Yeah, very good.
Do I sit down now? Okay. Here, that one's on.
Thank you. Hi, team. I gave this presentation in front of the Heartland Presbytery recently, and I came up to the pulpit. This isn't quite a pulpit, but they had all these toys under here. So I'm looking for, I don't, that was nice. You know, this is great having Patrick go in front of me. In fact, if I could take you with me everywhere, I normally feel like, you know, the first half of my presentation is a lot of doom and gloom, and Patrick already covered that, so I can just skip through that part.
I don't like the sugarcoat stuff.
I hear that. I come from the campaign background, so I most recently worked for Mayor Mark Cullen in Kansas City, Kansas. We won an election, we lost an election. I managed both of those, if that helps you identify my credentials. I also managed Congressman Dennis Moore's campaign in 2008, his last run. So I came out of these elections frustrated by the things that Patrick pointed out. In a mayoral race, especially in a local race, you don't have the resources to talk to non-voters. And you think about, like in Wyandotte County, a lot of our races are determined because they're actually partisan. A lot of our races can be determined in primary elections. So our district attorney, for example, was elected out of his August primary, and those percentage turnouts are so low and so depressing. So I came out of Mark Cullen's office looking for a project that I could sink my teeth into to increase voter turnout. And like Patrick said, a lot of the methods we've been using aren't effective. So I started with Mainstream, with their Education Foundation in May, to pilot a project that really focuses in on two of the places where Patrick said we might have more effects, and that's with peer-to-peer, talking to your friends and your family, and then applying some gentle social pressure, and I'll show you a little bit more about that. But just so you know, this project is being funded by the Reach Healthcare Foundation. They partnered with the Kansas Health Foundation and the Greater Kansas City Healthcare Foundation to fund 10 or 11 organizations over 3 years to do what they're calling integrated voter engagement. This is really rare. This is new for a health foundation to jump into the voter engagement space, and I commend them for this. They're really doing something that other health foundations across the country aren't doing, which is brave, but it also means there are a lot of eyes on this, a lot of people who are skeptical that it'll work. So we hopefully can make it work. But it's also cool because it's a 3-year grant. So we're piloting this project, Voter to Voter, in 2018, but we can work through 2019 and 2020 to improve the program, which on campaigns I never had the opportunity to do, right? Get through an election, see what went wrong, correct. If you lose, you can't correct, right? So we already did this. 36% was the turnout in 2014. These are your Johnson County turnout numbers. You know, I ran your registration rate recently, and this kind of blew my mind. Normally, well, at the national level, they say 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 eligible adults is not registered to vote. Your registration rate in Johnson County is 92%. A big round of applause for League of Women Voters. I think a lot of that's on you. We already talked about this too, but your city school election last year, your turnout was 17% in Johnson County. 70% in the presidential election. I live in Wyandotte County. In 2014, your percent was 50%, 51%. That was about the statewide turnout. Johnson County, or Wyandotte County's turnout 4 years ago was 36%, which was right at the national average. Now, if you see Steve Kraske, he'll say if Wyandotte County had turned out at 50%, it would have changed that election, but it's not quite true. I also don't believe in silver bullets to increase voter turnout. Barriers are vast and deeply personal. People don't vote for a lot of reasons. We think they're hard to identify, and like Patrick said, campaigns aren't usually the right messenger. So I can guess why someone who lives at 10th and Central in downtown Kansas City, Kansas isn't voting. I can look at their census tract and determine it's a highly Hispanic census tract. I can look at their voting history. I can look at their age, and I can send a mailer based on that best guess, and we're not going to move them there. We're not going to move them there. Voting is sticky, though. So when we talk about finding young voters and encouraging them to vote, we know that 30 to 50% of the time they're going to vote again. So we're looking at getting to young voters, we're looking to get to non-voters, and we're looking to touch them with the people that they know. So these voter contact methods that Patrick said weren't effective. Postcards, robocalls, even electoral reform. Average increase of about 0.5% to 1.5%. The methods that are effective, we'll talk about door-to-door. So actually having a conversation with someone where you can nuance. Our contact rates are a lot lower than they used to be. So nationally, the contact rate at the door was 35% in 2008. Nationally, in 2016, that was 8%. I just added that ouch. I'm really excited that I can do that on a Now, we're still mainstream. The other side of mainstream, their C4, their partisan arm, is still going door to door. Because having conversations with someone is the most effective way to move someone to action. We're getting higher than 8% rates at the door. That's a national average. So if you're in a well-established neighborhood, you're going to have higher contact rates. Interestingly, they've had better contact rates, and I haven't done a lot of research into this yet, but they've had better contact rates in some older neighborhoods in northeast Johnson County than they are, for example, in some brand new neighborhoods in southern Johnson County. So people who are more comfortable with their neighbors, I think it's all anecdotal, but I'm going to use it anyway. So relational organizing, talking to your friends, this is not a new concept. The Civil Rights Movement was a relational organizing movement. What's new is scaling it and then tracking it. So the relational organizing efforts that have been studied in the last couple of cycles that were used to move turnout are showing a much higher increase in turnout than the methods that Patrick and I have talked about so far. So 8%, 10%, if it's not a highly contested race without a lot of media attention, we can make a bigger increase. So what we want to do is try to scale and track. So to scale, we're trying to find 1,000 people who say they will talk to their friends and make sure they go vote. And this isn't a passive, hey Patrick, you voting on Tuesday? Just say
Just
yeah.
choose it. Sure, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Sweet. Thanks. It isn't a passive thing. It's a find 5 or 10 people, and you do everything you can to get in there, right? So my next door neighbors, for example, I signed up last year to vote by mail, to help them vote by mail. So they all had ballots mailed to their homes. I live next door to someone who works at KU Med. He's a professor, an architect, a teacher, a photographer. And what I found out later was that only 1 out of the 4 had voted, even though their ballots were mailed to their homes. And I was thinking, okay, they know, like, I work for the mayor, I could lose my job, right? That seems like you might vote. But if I had looked at their voting history, I would have seen that none of them had ever voted. And they're in their late 30s, like me. They're non-voters, and we heard Patrick's stat, and I hadn't heard that before, that once you're 30, if you've never voted, it's really unlikely that you're going to get to go. I mean, think about if you're 35, 36, 37, you've never gone, you have some pretty solid excuses cemented in your heart somewhere. You've got a barrier that we need to figure out how to get around. So this time, I came up to them in the primary, and I said, okay, friends, you're going to vote. Here's your advanced ballot application, fill it out. And this time, instead of being passive, I came back then 20 days out, and I texted, and I said, hey, my ballot's in the mail. Is your ballot in the mail? And they said, yeah, I got here today. Well, I should point out that there were a lot of steps in between there where they said, oh, I don't want to do it. Okay, so we had to get through that where I just said, I don't care. It doesn't matter. I don't care who you vote for, which is kind of untrue, but this is a nonpartisan project, so I don't care who you vote for. Let's just do it. In Wyandotte County, we didn't have to affiliate in the primary because we had one nonpartisan issue on our ballot, so I didn't have to explain that. They didn't have to do the scary thing and actually affiliate with a party. And I said, my ballot's in the mail. Is your ballot in the mail? And they said, yeah. And I said, okay, I'm coming over. I'm going to grab it. I'll stick it in the mailbox for you. Okay, so this is what we're talking about. Adopt 10 of your friends. Do everything you need to do to get them there. They all thanked me later for pushing so hard, but all of them said, oh, we don't even know where to start. We don't know who to vote for. We don't know what to do. So it's tricky. Now, to make this a little easier on ourselves and to build in layers of leadership that really will make the project more effective in the long term is that we're finding teams. So we have a League of Women Voters team, for example, that Jill Quigley is our team leader for. It's like a Ponzi scheme, but we get good democracy in the end instead of Tupperware, right? Okay, so now we're talking to, in theory, 10,000 voters. We're really excited about it. We're going to reach out to our friends and family and the people closest to us and make sure they go vote. How do we know if we were effective? 1. And then what can we do to add in that social pressure element? That mailer, for example, that says, here's your voting record compared to your neighbor's voting record. We wanted to use the power of that. So we built a tool called Voter to Voter that is attached right to the state public voter file. So this is something campaigns use, right? It's why I got 17 pieces of mail before the primary and my next door neighbors got 0, because they're all using my voting history. Obviously they don't know who I voted for, just whether or not I vote. And they said, okay, Lindsay comes out in primaries. Her neighbors obviously don't, although no, they do. Her neighbors don't vote. So they're using our voting history to target who they talk to. We want to give that power to the people. So we created this tool. It's tied to the voter file. So you go in, you adopt your 5 friends, you put them in your dashboard, it'll tell you their voting history. So it'll tell you if they vote. So if I had seen that with my neighbors, if I had known they weren't voters, I would have known what kind of pressure to apply. Now I didn't tell my neighbors, I know you don't vote. Sometimes can be a little creepy. I mean, I'm already kind of the creepy neighbor, so it's not that big a stretch, but I did say, I'm part of this project. I have to get people out to vote. If you don't vote, I'll lose points, and the League of Women Voters team will beat me, and that can't happen. So I have to win. You're accountable to me. So I didn't say, I know you don't vote, but I did imply that I'm watching them moving forward, and I will know if they cast their ballot in November. And there is some real power to knowing you're being watched, right? So when you get into the voter, or when you get into voter to voter, this is Johnson and Wyandotte County, and I meant to run this for just Johnson, but nearly 50% of registered voters will be, and we're calling them, we rank them by how many of the last 4 elections they voted in. They're not actually the last 4. They're 4 elections that I chose that are all a little bit different. So a city election, a presidential, a midterm, a primary. We call them 0, 4, 1, 4, 2, 4, 3, or 4, 4, 4. So it's not perfect. If you move in from out of state, your voting history doesn't follow you, for example. If you're a brand new voter, if you're 18, it'll say you're 0 of 4, even though you might be really gung-ho. But 50% of registered voters will be 0 or 1 of 4. Only 11% of registered voters in Johnson and Wyandotte County will be 4 of 4. So if you find those people in your dashboards, I'm saying recruit them to your Ponzi scheme. They're hardcore. They're weird, like you. Okay, so we had 2,500 voters that we were tracking before the primary, so that we had adopted before the primary. Now I'll say, let's say you signed up for this. We get your email address and we email you once a week in the last 6 weeks of the election with nonpartisan tips and information about how to vote. So here's how you help Sally find her polling place. Here's a sample script if you want to text her. Here's where you get a sample ballot. We lean very heavily on the leaks. 411 site, thank you.
Yes, it is.
We're not asking for the email addresses or the phone numbers of your friends because we don't want to contact them. We think we lose that real peer-to-peer once a third party comes in. So we're not trying to build a list here. We're just using this as a tool for our volunteers so they can apply that social pressure and so we can track our results over time and see if this is effective. Now in the primary we had 2,500 voters in there. It's a little easier to move turnout in primary since they're lower turnout anyway. Of those 2,500, 60% of them voted. Now that was compared to a 25 or a 27% turnout statewide. Now as a caveat, we started with better voters. So we had more 3 of 4s and 4 of 4s in there than the population as a whole. But nearly 30% of the voters in my system were what I'd call very low propensity, so 0, 4, 1 of 4. And they turned out at about 38, 40%, which I think is really pretty incredible. Our 2 of 4s, which I'm generalizing, but are typically people who vote every other year in November but don't come out in primaries, voted at 54%. So we feel really good about that. Interestingly, our 18-year-olds and our 50-year-olds voted at the same rate. They all voted at 58%.
Interesting.
What really made the difference was your voter propensity. So if you were a 30-year-old or a 40-year-old who had never voted, it was a lot less likely in this program that anybody could move you. It took some real pushing and pulling to get those people out. In fact, our 0 of 4s, I don't know if you can see this, voted at a better rate than our 1 of 4s, which makes me think that that was probably a lot of our young, high school, newly engaged, excited, ready to go voters. 95% of our ambassadors, our volunteer ambassadors voted, so that's good. And honestly, I know you're like, what about the other 5%? We do have some undocumented volunteers in this project, and we do have some people under the age of 18, which I think is cool. This project doesn't really get to the root of the problem unless my ambassadors are a diverse group of ambassadors, right? So we have some black churches in Wyandotte County that have signed on. We have some health clinics that have signed on. We're trying to find partners that also reach younger voters, people of color, people with less educational opportunity, so that we're really getting to those low propensity voters. But honestly, you might be surprised at the non-voters in your networks. It may take a little bit extra effort to find them, but they will be there. And you can move them too. Voters in our project who request an advance ballot turned those in at a 95% rate. We didn't have that many that requested advance ballots, and a lot of them were our volunteers, but I thought that was interesting. So voter2voter.org, that's the site. We're going to talk about it when we're done here. So we're going to go look at the site, and anybody who already has a dashboard or a team can come join us. Anybody have questions for Patrick or I?
I think we have questions maybe being come in on cards.
Do we have someone leading the question and answer? Ellen, do you want the mic for that?
Let me, yeah, and then you'll have one.
I believe that Kathy Nix and Marty Birch will be collecting cards, questions that you would like to ask, and I'll just kind of curate them so that our speakers don't have to, and I'll just collect them up here and we'll just ask them as quickly as possible. So if we have any cards right now, questions, then just pass it to the outside and Kathy will bring them in. Kathy and Marty. Okay, so let's just take a quick look and get us started right away. And thank you for those of you who are delineating exactly who you want the question to go to. You put Patrick or Lindsay on there, but if there's nothing there, we'll just have kind of throw it out there. Is that okay with you? And thank you so much for that. Okay, the first one here is, how effective are the 30-second political attack ads on TV? And how do we get rid of them? So,
well, I can answer that one. You know, most elections in America are partisan, up and down the ballot, from dog catcher and water board to the presidency. So you all are in a little bit of a different context here in Kansas in that you have nonpartisan local elections. In a partisan election, typically 80 to 90% of us are just going to vote our party. We come to a very predictable choice in the end anyway. And so campaigns are really about that 10, 15, 20%. And again, if you think about what moves people to often, weigh information the strongest or break from their voting habits and not vote for their party, it's negativity. And all the studies, both commercial studies and academic studies, will tell you that negative ads are incredibly effective. They move voters, and positive ads really don't. Positive advertising just reinforces the predispositions you already have. So if you have that incumbent who's 40 points ahead, and they just have to remind you that you like them, yay them, they're going to air that positive ad. That's not changing many minds. And campaign practitioners know this. They're not totally alienated from the world of what I do or us from them. And so bluntly, until we change human psychology and we're just like, I'm such a good person and you're going to vote for me because I put that in my campaign ad, right? Until we start responding to that, which we're not, you're not going to get rid of these.
Okay. All right. The next question is actually, again, to Patrick. Does encouraging voters to fill out the advance ballot? I think you answered that a question that the advance ballot may or may not be as useful. A second question was, which states have same-day registration and has it increased turnout?
Yeah, so I'm not aware of any studies that actually look at what happens when a voter has to actively choose to fill out the form, and then does just filling it out increase the likelihood that they're going to vote. I would imagine it does, but I can't exactly cite that with any kind of backed up data. But I would imagine that it probably doesn't increase it much, because again, if you look at the elections, like a lot of our local tax elections in Kansas, where I don't even have to do that. The ballot just comes to me. They're often the lowest turnout. So maybe some effect, probably not very big. With the same-day registration, it changes. The one without looking at a map, Minnesota is one that comes to mind. And yeah, when Minnesota instituted that, they did have a marked increase in voter turnout, particularly among your lower propensity groups who aren't paying as much attention along the way. And that's generally a result that we've seen in the few states that have adopted that. North Dakota doesn't have voter registration. It's really kind of weird, so we just asterisk them. But yeah, it can have an effect.
One point I want to make about advanced ballots, and I've read the same studies that they don't really move the needle when it comes to motivating people who don't already vote. But as an organizer, advanced ballots give me a lot more control over making sure people actually cast a ballot. So like that story where I actually went to my neighbors and said, you know, do you have your ballots? Are they in your hands? Do you need help getting through them? That gave me a lot of control as an organizer to make sure those ballots were cast, which is hard to do in with a lot of people, but I think with 5 or 10, it's pretty manageable.
These are a couple are similarly related, so I'm going to kind of put them together. One question for voter to voter. My network is very engaged. Is there some way that I could adopt some non-voters? And then this one I thought is kind of related. Short of cutting them out of my will, how do I get my college-educated grandchildren to vote? And I'm going to tell you, you get some good questions out of this group. So how do we get the non-engaged? Is there something else that we can do? Because that's one of the other questions. How do I get involved at this point, even though you've told us it's too late, right?
Not necessarily too late. I mean, I'm half Sicilian. My mother is Sicilian. If she wants me to get something that wants me to do something that I don't want to do, guilt. Like guilt. Overriding guilt. Like, I'll be dead soon. Do this for me. It's my wish. Kind of like Sophia Petrillo in the Golden Girls kind of guilt. It's not hopeless, but I would say if you're thinking about like your grandkids are part of an age cohort. Now, I would say back in the 60s and 50s, we also were concerned about young people then because you seemed less positive about politics than your parents. But every generation gets more and more negative, and it's interesting to me as a political scientist just to see how negative you can get. But that said, if you're thinking about your grandchild has turned 18, they've already existed for 18 years in a political culture that is extremely cynical and negative about politics and politicians. And they have attitudes that are formed that you need to deal with. And I would say it's probably the same way that you get them to do anything, like call you or come visit. It is, don't just be like, hey, this is your civic duty, or maybe even do this for me. I mean, pressing on them, poking them a little bit. Maybe it's guilty, maybe it's a little bit of negativity, because you have to get them to rethink all of these suppositions that they have that this process is corrupt and they don't matter.
Yeah, I would say, ideally, my friends who are non-voters internalize their own motivations for getting there. I am not under the delusion that I'm going to fix that in the next month. So I feel like there's something to be said about getting over the hump. There's an intimidation factor that comes with voting, especially if you're one of these non-voters that's now in their 30s or 40s or 50s and have never been. You think you should know how to do it. You don't want to ask. You don't want to do something that makes you feel stupid. So I feel like there's some power in getting someone over the hump and just making the act of it happen. I think it could cause some momentum to encourage that person to vote moving forward.
Well, I just want to add to that. If you're thinking about your grandkids, I mean, there are some logistical issues, particularly with college students. A lot of college students don't vote because if they're registered, they're not registered where they're going to college. So if you're a student at KU, you can actually register at your home address back in Johnson County or whatever, or you can vote in Lawrence. And this has been looked at, so I mean, it's not just an issue with Kansas. If you're a college student and you're not registered in your college town, you've got a 75% chance you're not going to vote, because driving home, even 20 miles, can be a pretty big impediment.
Yes.
So if you have that grandchild in college, asking them, checking where they are registered, in the place that they're most likely to put in the minimal effort to go do it. But also like speaking with them in their language. Like once you vote, get an I voted sticker, take a selfie with it, and in the voting place, I don't know, with a newspaper that shows the date, like, they're into selfies. Make them be accountable to you in a way that they're used to being accountable.
I was at an event just last Tuesday, and there were several women there who had their children there, and I said, oh, it's so great that you brought these children, your daughter here. I said, are you also going to take them into the voting booth with you? And again, the guilting thing is maybe you just need a ride. to the voting booth, and maybe your grandchild is the one who will drive you there. That kind of gets them into that space. So that's another way to guilt them into that piece. So.
Oh, I feel like that. You could fake an injury and then require someone to drive you.
And they need to help you. So I mean, I know this group of women, they are not infirm, but we are not opposed to acting to get you into that voting booth.
Democracy is ugly. It doesn't always work.
Here's a question. Would making election day a holiday or moving it to a weekend make a difference, or is that something that's beyond this scope?
It's really hard to tell in the context of the U.S. because in most countries that have election day as a holiday or as a weekend were already very high turnout countries before they adopted that, and a lot of them have mandatory voting, where you may have some kind of penalty or fine if you don't vote. So it gets really hard to figure out exactly what it would do here because we don't really have a great comparison. I will say, there are some places in America where we do have weekend voting, like primaries in Louisiana. When Louisiana adopted that, they didn't see an increase in turnout in their first general election. Turnout actually went down from when it was on a Tuesday. But in their second election like that, they did have an increase because they had a competitive gubernatorial election. So I think it's like a lot of the things that we talk about, it's not necessarily when the election is or how accessible it is, but what is actually bringing people out, whether it's on a Tuesday or a Saturday. Although, a competitive election might be easier to vote on a Saturday. And if you think of like the easiest turnout elections, again, when Douglas County mails me my ballot and it sits on my kitchen counter for a week to vote in some tax referendum, I'm mostly not voting. So I'm really skeptical that those reforms would have a big effect, but it's really hard to say concretely.
These are kind of related, and a couple of these things is how effective are things like Souls to the Polls, and again, this is again related to the early voting. Is there such an initiative in the Kansas City area, and how should we organize?
Well, in terms of, I'll come back to what we know about early voting, because early voting really caught on as a trend in the mid-2000s in a lot of places. And the immediate punchline was just because you adopt early voting, that doesn't mean turnout's going to increase. It's what happens to exploit early voting. So early voting is most effective, in most elections, right, where people are not making a big effort to get early voters out, campaigns in particular, your early voters are the people who would have likely voted on election day anyway. That's great for a campaign because you can bank your votes early and then put your get out the vote effort into your harder to turn out voters. But in those places where we see where early voting can attract lower propensity voters, it's when campaigns in particular target those groups and put a lot of effort into really mobilizing them. So an excellent example, in the 2008 election, I was in Chapel Hill, and the Obama campaign in North Carolina hired field organizers at places like UNC's campus or in majority black rural and urban precincts, and specifically tasked them with partnering with churches, partnering with other kinds of organizations where people might go in a non-political context, and trying to get them to early voting as hard as possible. They opened up their data. I mean, most of their effort was wasted in the sense that those voters didn't vote, but they did see a big increase in these lower turnout groups when they really tried to exploit that window. So that's when it's going to be most effective. The reform isn't enough. You have to push to use it.
Have you all heard that phrase, Souls to the Polls? Do you know what we're talking about? It's when we host Get Out the Vote events with churches.
Yes.
A lot of places that have Sunday voting will use them, and they'll try to move congregations right to polling locations after church. I've worked on a couple of these Souls to the Polls efforts. I'm working on organizing one now with some other nonpartisan partners in Kansas City, Kansas. I think the powerful part is when your pastor or the people in your congregations enforce a message of voting. Because again, we're empowering a messenger that people trust, rather than hearing it from a campaign or a field organizer. If they're hearing it from their pastor or the people in their congregations that they already know and trust, then that may help.
I know that this came up actually when I was doing a presentation to the Rotary, and the question is, we have people who don't want to vote because they don't know. So here's the question: how do we get folks to vote who say they'll just be voting uninformed and shouldn't vote? So is there anything that you would, I mean, is there something to say to that, is one of the questions.
You know, the ironic thing is that most Americans are just partisan voters, and the one piece of information that we're basing our vote on most of the time is who's our party. If you're in a party, you can generally guess correctly that you have a certain set of values and preferences that someone in that party will reflect. So it's not totally ignorant, though. But yeah, I mean, I see that more as an excuse, because when we study what voters know about elections and campaigns, they don't know nearly as much as we like to think that they do. And even when you ask them like open-ended questions and surveys, and it's like, tell me what you know, you might get 2 or 3 facts. So if someone's saying, well, I just don't know, you can be that person who engages them and helps teach them that social pressure. But I think it's really more of an excuse.
And I guess I always say you don't have to vote in every single, don't have to have a check mark in every single space. Is that correct? I mean,
Sure.
If you don't know, you don't have to vote. Here's one, and I think we have 2 more to go. Just one or 2? How does voter ID restrictions affect our voter turnout? If it's hard to vote for those people who manage, how is voter ID restrictions affecting our voter turnout?
Yeah, oh boy. Well, with voter ID, there are a range of there's a range in how restrictive that can be. In the, I would say, least restrictive category of states, there can be 12 or 15 different kinds of documentation that you can use to prove who you are. And in those states, where it's not necessarily just a government-issued driver's license with your current correct name, married women, that's a big impediment in some states, and your current correct address. Like if I'm able to use a utility bill, then a state that has that kind of regulation, we will see a little bit of a decrease, particularly among Latino and African American and young voters, and poor voters, even if they're white, but not as much. The biggest drops we're going to see are in the states that are highly restrictive. They're going to say, if you're going to vote, you have to have something like a driver's license, current name, current address, and a different form of ID might be unacceptable. And so if we look at who doesn't tend to have that ID, it tends to be poorer people of all races. It tends to be more concentrated among African Americans and Latinos, senior citizens who maybe aren't driving anymore, even higher income, which is why in some states they're exempted from voter ID, or even young students, young people sometimes who don't have a car, so they've let that driver's license lapse, perhaps. So those are the groups that we know are decreased the most. Is partly not having the ID, but also particularly if you think about Latino and Asian populations, they're just newer to the political process, they're more suspicious of it, they're not as trusting of it. It's also an additional barrier just psychologically, and we know that that's an effect from studying them. In terms of how much that declines, the average decline from a high restrictive voter ID that we're looking at, depending upon the state, is anywhere from 2 to 6%. That's not most, but that among your most vulnerable populations. That's not most, but that's still something.
Patrick has a probably better knowledge base on this, but I think anecdotally, if you're a non-voter and you have voting on a list of things to do on a Tuesday, and it comes after clean up the food that my 2-year-old just threw at me and pick up milk because that also went on the floor. Voter ID and voter confusion just adds one more reason to not go. If you don't know the rules, I think voter confusion is a form of voter suppression in itself.
Yes, it is.
And if there's some sense here like, oh, I don't know if my ID is going to count. I don't even know what to take. The rules have been changing. I think it's really easy for a non-voter to use that as an excuse as well.
I also want to add to that, something I didn't tackle, is actual enforcement is a big issue with this. And we know from more so public administration people who look at this and they look at the actual enforcement of voter regulations on the ground, that a majority African American or majority Latino precinct is twice as likely to actually have voter ID requirements enforced at the polls. Ohio is an excellent example of this. Ohio did a self-study on this. I can tell you when I voted in Ohio in 2012, there were 2 precincts in the bowling alley I voted in. One extremely white, I lived in that one extremely African American, 2 different lines on the same side, on different sides of the same room. I didn't show my photo ID, but everyone on the other side of the room was. And Ohio did a self-study and found that that was actually very common. And particularly in white, highly educated, high-income precincts, where they're, granted, fewer of these voters are present who don't have an ID, they were much less likely to be asked to actually show it. Right? So it's not just, it's enforcement that's also an issue. And unfortunately, these kind of regulations are typically enforced against the most vulnerable populations. I'm not saying you shouldn't have an ID, but just understanding the dynamics of this.
I will tell you just real quickly, there are several here that are left over, and again, it speaks to the fact that so many of our members are so knowledgeable. One question, and we're not going to answer them, is it true that only 7% of the world's population vote? When did the culture of non-voting happen? Was it in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s? What about this 2-tier voting system that we have? A couple things about robocalls and clearing off deceased people from the rolls and stuff like that. So we have a lot. And then here's the one that I think will definitely, and one is, why does the military check the voting roll reports? But here's the one that I thought was kind of a good one to finish off with is, since women have a higher propensity of voting, should the league be focusing on men? Thank you, Marty Birch. So those are just to let you know that we've had many questions. We don't have enough time, and I thank you so much for letting me curate these.